Hey everyone, MythicODM here. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop RPGs since 1984, so yeah, a long time. I played from the original Red Box, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition. I played Pathfinder 1E and 2E, Starfinder, Fate, Castles and Crusades, Shadowrun, Numenera, The Dark Eye, and many, many more. I also ran a game store for over a decade, and I just completed running a LARP for 11 years. So yes, I am an old dungeon master.
You're old.
For this video, I wanted to share some tips and hopefully some wisdom about what you're about to do. Become a games master. So I guess this would be my GameMaster class. A dungeon master and game master, DM and GM, are pretty much the same thing, so I will likely be using those terms very interchangeably throughout all my videos. The only difference is a game master is pretty much a generic term for running any game. Dungeon Master is a term used when you're running Dungeons and Dragons. I have 8 topics that I'll cover in this video. There'll be timestamps in the video description, so you can just pop over to the sections you're most interested in, or skip to things that are less important to you. So my 8 topics are going to be: 1, knowing what you're getting into. Number 2, the rules. So not the nitty gritty of each tabletop RPG because that's its own beast, but more general information. Number 3, making it your game. Number 4, getting a group together. Number 5, learning to say no. Number 6, dice rolls, when to fudge them and when not. Number 7, learning to be flexible. And number 8, writing things down. All right, so let's get to it. So knowing what you're getting into. Know that what you're embarking on will take up a lot of time. When you watch other channels or live content, you see that the game master is the one running the show. There are hours of prep work involved that goes into running a game. Even taking a pre-made adventure and running it takes time. You must read the adventure, or if you're creating it for yourself as a homebrew. So when I say must, this is not an option as a game master. You need to know what the players are expected to do, or where they're going, the monsters and the conflicts they will face, and start preparing for what the players may do. Even running a game on a virtual tabletop, such as Fantasy Grounds or Foundry, you need to learn how to even run those programs. It is your job to teach these systems to other players as well. Some players may be veterans of these systems, others have never logged into a game using them. There is a lot to do as a game master. I spend many hours preparing for a game as I do running it, and much, much more. In a virtual tabletop, I have to check stat blocks of monsters, where they are on my computer. I have to organize the notes and so much more. For an in-person game, I read the adventure over several times, or at least the portions of the adventure I believe the players are going to get through in this one session. And then I always try to read just a little bit beyond that. I ran the Dungeon of the Mad Mage for D&D 5e for a group of 7 players for 3 years. I had to read, reread, and then read again multiple levels as the dungeon, as the players can teleport to other areas using a gate system. This happened very, very frequently, where the players decided to jump to another level, bypass an entire level, or search every square of a current level. I had to learn the Fantasy Grounds virtual tabletop. I added extensions and modules that helped with automation, but I had to explain how these worked to 7 players. It is a lot of work, and normally it is a very thankless thing you do.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you.
Your players' enjoyment or their frustrations land on your lap. There is a lot of pressure to run a game. You need to organize players for time to play.
Something to do with herding cats.
What happens when the players are not there, etc. I hope more players step up to being a game master, but not everyone is interested in running the circus, only being a performer in it.
I volunteer as tribute.
Number 2, rules. When you're ready to run a game, you need to settle on a system. Then you need to learn the rules of that system. You need to pick which rule books you're going to allow, which ones you will not. More on that when we get to the no section later in the video. Source books are there for a reason. You need to use them. The issue will become time and money. Reading them is very time consuming. Buying them is not cheap. Player's Handbook for D&D is, I think, about $45 Canadian, the cheapest. Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, the hardcover version, is, I think, $65 Canadian at the cheapest. Some games have their rules online for free. D&D just posted their system reference document, the SRD, on a Creative Commons license. Pathfinder is on a website called Archives of Nethys, and it is free as well. But if you need to run these on a virtual tabletop, there's a cost. Fantasy Grounds has an ultimate license for around $149 US. That allows all the players to connect to your game session. Foundry is $50 US. But then you need to purchase rules. You need to purchase adventures and other things that can increase the costs exponentially. If you're getting things together with friends, you can ask them to chip in for VTT stuff, have them purchase their own copies for in-game play, etc. But one thing to know is you do not have to break the bank for it. You do not need a whole bunch of fancy miniatures. You do not need a 3D printer to print those miniatures. You do not need all these different maps and stuff. You can do it on paper. You can do it a whole bunch of different ways that won't break your bank. I'll be running an entire video series about how to do it kind of on the cheap in a later video. Once you figure out all that, now you need to learn the rules. How does combat work? Are there skills involved in mundane things such as performing, climbing walls, etc.? Again, as a GM, you will be the one they look to for rules clarifications, which leads me to one extremely important thing. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know, let's look it up.
Honestly, I have no clue.
I've run games for nearly 40 years. I still look up rules every single session. Players misinterpret the rules. Game masters do the same. Some players try to bend the rules to fit the scenario. Your job as a game master is to figure out if that works for your game or not. There are rules as written, RAW, raw, rules as intended, RAI, or basically spirit of the rules. Then there are homebrew rules as well. You can decide what you want to use, but once you make a ruling one way, stick with it unless you realize it was really a bad interpretation.
We fucked up.
Just make sure you keep an open line of communication with your players on any changes and be prepared for them to ask you why.
Why?
Now, does this mean you need to know every rule inside and out? No, not at all. Most DMs cannot spend the time to read through hundreds of pages of rules. New books come out frequently, and keeping up can be a full-time job. My suggestion is to know what rules your players are running for classes, races, etc. Know what they're supposed to do. If no one is playing a monk in your game, don't bother reading up on them until you have some time. Same goes with species or ancestries. No one playing a dark elf? Well, then if they're not central to your story, you can ignore them. You need to know how combat works, how dice rolls work. And I don't mean like picking up a dice and rolling it, but how you get results. What is a success? What is a failure? This is a priority when it comes to your rules. This is where the players will be most frustrated if you just try to wing it. Number 3, make it your game. As a DM, you have to remember it is your game, and you need to be enjoying it just as much as the players. That is so vital to being a game master. If you dread running a game due to the players, the adventure, or just life in general, stop. Just stop. It is not worth your mental health to push through these. One of the best things you can do is what we call a slot zero, or some call it a session zero with your players. This is where you get them together to chat about the game, what you want to run, brainstorm characters, and generally see if the players are compatible with you and others. Setting expectations is so key. If you're running a very heavy political campaign or heavy RP, or it's going to be all combat, players need to understand this. They also need to know what rules you will or will not allow, like what kind of classes, races, source books, etc., that they can draw from. If you have homebrew rules, this is where you must tell your players. This also follows the main rule. It is your table. You are responsible for what happens at it at all times. So let's chat about what can side rail your table. So if the players at your table are the issue, you have several options. Number 1, my first suggestion is having a very frank discussion with the players about what they're doing or not doing that is aggravating you or other players at your table. Some players just do not know that they're doing something annoying until you have a chat with them out of game. If you can do it out of game, that's good. If it is really bad, during it also is acceptable. Number 2, remove the player from the campaign. This can be difficult if it is a friend or family member. But again, your table, you need to control it. If you've tried option 1 and they are not receptive to it, ignore it, or it gets worse, tell them not to come back until they can play under your rules at your table.
Leave.
Number 3, be receptive to feedback from players. Lots of players do not understand what constructive criticism means and may come off just as whining or complaining to you, etc. You as a GM should listen to what their grievances may be and see if you were in the wrong. It happens. If you're wrong, apologize, learn, and move on.
I was wrong.
If the issue is the adventure, there are a few things you can do. 1, change the adventure. This is where preparation comes in. If it is a pre-made adventure, you can alter some of it. If you think it's just not salvageable, you can pivot and either start from scratch or grab another adventure and go from there. I've literally stopped a campaign mid-game when it was apparent that things were just off the rails. The players weren't into it. I was losing interest. I added a new adventure, gave the PCs new goals, and after a few sessions, the original mod was back on with a breath of fresh air, and it truly needed it. Second thing you can do, drop the adventure completely and start over. This is kind of the nuclear option and should only be done if there's no hope of salvaging the current adventure. Some PCs may be receptive to it, others will not. Take this in consideration when choosing your option. Again, talk to your players. I cannot stress it enough how much open communication is. If life in general is the issue, well, that's going to be highly dependent on what's going on in your life. Do not feel obligated or pressured to run games when you are not into it. Your game will suffer. Just let your players know that your game is on hiatus for a bit or permanently. No one will or should ever fault you for dropping a game for real life issues. If they do, they weren't good players in the first place. How to get a group together? Well, how easy is it to herd cats? If you are a starting dungeon master, well, it can be easier than a player looking for groups. Dungeon masters are in short supply. Everyone wants to play. Not many want to take the time and the burden of being a DM. Some things you can do if you find yourself without a group is to check your local game stores to see if they need GMs or DMs for things like the Adventurers League for 5e or Pathfinder or Starfinder society games. If that fails, try online through social media like Facebook and Reddit. Check with RPG companies to see if they have Discord channels as well. A lot of them post a looking for group. Lastly, if you think you're good enough and know your stuff, you can even try to get paid for your work through services like Start Playing Games. Once you start to get a group together, especially if this is a home campaign, I cannot stress this point enough. Run the slot 0. Again, slot 0, session 0, same thing. So what is a slot 0, you ask? Glad you did. This is where you speak with your players well before the game begins. It can be weeks or more before your first actual game. This is where you learn what they would like to play, give them relevant background for your adventure and the world and how their characters will fit into it. This is where you talk about homebrew rules, what your game will be like, such as combat heavy or role play leaning, etc. This is so critical that I will be doing an entire video on this subject. A slot 0 is where you can learn more about your players and them about you. This is where you can draw the line on specific subjects, either in-game or out-of-game. This is the time where any red flags that may come up can be dealt with. Remember, you can always tell a player no. That leads into my next topic, and one I love to talk about, saying no.
No. No. Mm-mm. Mm-mm. No. 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 Hell no. 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 I refuse. No. No.
So many issues can be avoided if DMs and players would just learn that you can say no. You do not have to roll with things just because someone at the table insists on it. You are the final say at your table and how you want it to run. If, for instance, you're running an introductory campaign and someone wants to bring in a class or species that you do not see in your game, you can say no. Do they have a backstory that makes you or others at the table uncomfortable? Say no. Do they want to bend rules to fit their character and it breaks the game fundamentally? Yeah, that's a big no for me. But remember, the players can also say no to you. If you as a DM make players uncomfortable with table talk or direction that you're going, they can tell you no as well. No one wants to be in an uncomfortable situation, and they should not be. The amount of posts I see on all the different game system Reddits that just devolve into everyone telling either the player or the game master to just leave is astounding.
Get out of here! Get out of here!
As a DM, you have every right to say no to any player. That being said, if you're saying no just because you don't like something the character is capable of doing, not the player, but the character, that is something you should have addressed in your slot 0.
Are you such a dick?
See how much all this stuff is interconnected? So dice rolls. Let's get into some interesting things. Let the dice fall where they may, or not. The debate has been ongoing. There are pros and cons to fudging the dice rolls. There are so many threads on Reddit and Discord and other forums about letting the dice go. There's videos about the topics. In a VTT, you really don't have much choice. The dice are generated and the results are dropped into chat for all to see. There is a way for GMs to mask their roles in some systems. I know Fantasy Grounds has that kind of setting, but for the most part, players' roles are out in the open. I think that if you're using a virtual tabletop, you as a DM should let the dice fall where they may. Sometimes it works for the characters. Other times, well, there's a reason players have to roll up new characters. In person is also a different story. Some GMs use a GM screen. It hides information such as maps, monsters, stats, and they also have useful charts and information you need. Pretty handy when you run a game. It's easy to fudge rolls either way for the favor of the players or to the detriment of. Normally, I don't use a screen, but in my current Pathfinder game, it holds so much useful information that I also have a couple monitors that show maps and stats that they need to be screened from the players. Have I fudged rolls? Sure. When it suits the game. Sometimes the dice just hate the players or the dungeon masters. So dying just because the dice will it to be so is kind of rough on a PC. You need to decide if it's better for the fun of the game to cheat for your players or just let the dice fall where they may. Don't cheat to try to win as a GM. Wrecking the fun of all the players at your table just to make yourself feel superior is just bad. Don't do it. So you also need to learn to be flexible. Saying no all the time may not always be the best idea. Improvising sometimes leads to great stories that players will remember forever. You'll have a story plan and the pieces will go completely somewhere you're not expecting, and they will just murder hobo the bad guy, or they won't murder hobo someone they should have, or whatever, and so many more things. As a DM, you can do your best to limit how off track the players can be, but sometimes there is such a weird and fun or frustrating way that players come up to solve your puzzles, and sometimes they will mess it up beyond saving. My rule of thumb is if a PC wants to try something weird, I'll get a little bit more information, ask what they're planning on doing or how they're planning on doing it, and either assign a roll or a skill check to let it happen, and let's just see what it does. In our LARP, this happened all the time. I cannot tell you how many times we'd be sending out a mod with the monsters and a marshal, which is a LARP equivalent of a game master, a kind of script as what's supposed to happen, with another script for if PCs do X, then we do Y. And suddenly they would come back hours later and the PCs had completely gone off the rails. They either saved the big bad guy, or they killed an important NPC that was supposed to supply them information. They couldn't figure out a puzzle, or they came up with an absolute brilliant solution that we never thought of. All we could do is pivot, add or change some story, and integrate it into our ongoing plot. Out of one of those insane instances that the best stories come to life. This is the keystone of dungeon mastering. Learning how to pivot and either rewrite the story or somehow get the players back on track. Writing things down. When you're a player, write things down that the GM tells you. Names, dates, locations, etc. When you're a DM, write the things down that the players tell you. Names, dates, locations, etc. Yes, it goes both ways. If you come up with a name on the spot, write it down. You never know when the NPC farmhand that you had to make a name up for because you forgot to suddenly becomes the focus of the players several sessions later. Have your notable NPCs, towns, and locations jotted down somewhere handy. I have a printout of NPC names hung just on the inside of my GM screen for that exact reason. Now, if you need to stop in the middle of combat, and please avoid that at all costs. You need to keep track of things like the initiative order, where the monsters and players are, the players' hit points, resources spent, etc. And it all has to be written down so you're ready to go when you start the next time you meet. Use your phone. Snap some pictures of the battle map. If you're on a virtual tabletop, make sure it goes through a save cycle before you shut everything down. I could go on to a rant about why you should never start combat near the end of a session, but I can leave that to another time. But it is a responsibility of both the players and the GM to write things down for future reference. The amount of times at our LARP over a decade that players would remember random NPC number 257 a year after you brought them out once was pretty impressive and super frustrating to the writers. We had pages upon pages of names, locations, dates, costume notes, heraldry, etc., and more that we would have to dig through on multiple occasions to reference back on.
Write that down.
In conclusion, I think being a game master is an absolutely wonderful experience. You have so much creative control on your story. You get to bring so much fun to your friends or others. Hours of exploring a world that you have created. interacting with NPCs and monsters of your own design that you get to bring to life. But I tell you from experience that burnout is real. You'll be exhausted from dealing with in-game and out-of-game things from your players. Life will constantly interrupt your well-laid plans. Players will complain about the story, the monsters, and more. It will happen.
You suck, you jackass.
You just need to figure out if the cons outweigh the pros. In my opinion, they do. I've had pretty rough sessions. Rough games at LARP where everyone was mad, and lots of times it had nothing to do with me or the story. Everyone will have good and bad days. Just hope that the good outweighs the bad. I've been very lucky to have had way more good times at my games, be it tabletop or LARP. And to me, the smiles, the laughs shared, and even the tears shed were so worth it. It is why I still am and will continue to be an old dungeon master. So as always, thank you for spending your time with me in this crazy life of becoming a game master. If you're interested in more content, please like and subscribe below and click the bell for notifications on new videos. Comment below on things you're doing and creating, questions you may have, etc., and hopefully I can help you out. Let me know topics you'd like me to talk about or game systems you'd like me to see covered, and I'll just add it to my list. In the meantime, and in between time, that's it. Another Mythic episode. Thank you for watching, and all your games be full of myth, mirth, and magic.